Okay, so you want to own a container ship, a floating steel box the length of 4 football fields, carrying 20,000 smaller boxes across an ocean, collecting a fee for every single one.
Global trade doesn't move without ships like yours. 90% of everything on Earth crosses an ocean at some point, and it has to travel inside a vessel exactly like the one you're picturing.
That is the dream, and it is not entirely wrong. Here's what it doesn't tell you. You can own a fleet of perfectly functional, fully loaded ships worth billions of dollars combined, and still watch the entire company collapse in a matter of weeks, with your own vessels turned away from port after port, their crews rationing food and water while $14 billion of someone else's cargo sits stranded at sea because nobody trusts your company to pay the docking fee.
Let's start with what it costs to buy one. Prices scale directly with capacity. Feeder ships, the smaller vessels running regional routes between hub ports, run $25 to $55 million new.
Standard long-haul workhorses in the 5,000 to 10,000 TEU range, the backbone of intercontinental trade, run $60 to $110 million.
At the very top of the market, ultra-large container vessels exceeding 20,000 TEU can reach $180 to $220 million per ship. And in 2025, Evergreen set a new industry record, agreeing to pay $267.3 million per vessel for 6 24,000 TEU Megamaxes, more than $100 million above what a similar ship cost just 5 years earlier.
On a per-slot basis, that works out to roughly $11,000 for every single container space on board, before the ship has carried a single box.
Before a ship earns $1, you're already carrying enormous fixed costs simply for the privilege of owning it. Steel and raw material prices swing the build cost significantly, and shipyard choice alone can create a 20 to 40% difference in final price for functionally identical vessels, since China, South Korea, and Japan compete aggressively on both cost and delivery timelines. Once built, a ship needs a trained, licensed crew, mandatory insurance and classification society certification, and scheduled dry dock maintenance every few years, all of which run regardless of whether the ship is fully booked or sailing half empty. And unlike a warehouse that can simply sit closed during a slow month, a container ship generates no revenue at all while docked, yet still accrues crew wages, fuel for auxiliary power, port fees, and financing costs every single day it isn't moving cargo.
Here's the trap sitting underneath the entire industry, and it's the one that has repeatedly brought down carriers far larger than any single ship owner. Container shipping is a brutally cyclical, overcapacity-prone business. When freight rates are high, as they were through much of the early 2020s, shipping lines rush to order new megaships, exactly the wave that produced Evergreen's record-breaking order. But ships take years to build, and by the time a wave of new capacity actually enters the water, demand has often shifted, leaving too many ships chasing too little cargo. In the year before Hanjin Shipping's collapse, the container industry as a whole posted operating losses approaching $20 billion in a single year, driven by exactly this dynamic: freight rates collapsing under the weight of a capacity glut that every carrier had helped create by ordering ships during the previous boom. Once a ship is actually sailing full, the revenue model is straightforward. Carriers charge per container, typically quoted per 20-foot equivalent unit, with rates fluctuating heavily based on route, season, and overall industry capacity.
Long-term contracts with major shippers, retailers, and manufacturers who need guaranteed capacity year-round provide more predictable revenue than the spot market, where prices can spike or collapse by 50% or more within weeks, depending on global demand and available ship capacity. Larger vessels carry a genuine cost advantage per container, since fuel and crew costs don't scale linearly with capacity,
which is exactly why the industry has spent the last decade racing toward ever larger mega ships, even though that same race is what floods the market with capacity during every downturn. Now, the disaster case study, and it remains the largest container shipping bankruptcy in history. Hanjin Shipping, South Korea's largest carrier and the seventh largest in the world, had been losing money for years as freight rates collapsed under industry-wide overcapacity, the same boom-to-bust cycle that has defined this business for decades. By mid-2016, the company was roughly $5.5 billion in debt, and when its creditors finally withdrew further financial support, Hanjin filed for bankruptcy protection in Seoul on August 31, 2016. The consequences were immediate and almost unimaginable in scale. More than 500,000 containers, carrying an estimated $14 to $15 billion worth of goods. Everything from Samsung electronics to Nike sneakers to fresh seafood were suddenly stranded aboard dozens of Hanjin vessels scattered across the globe. Ports worldwide refused to let the ships dock, fearing Hanjin could no longer pay docking fees or stevedore costs, and several vessels were seized outright by creditors in the United States, China, and Panama. Crews aboard the marooned ships watched their food and water supplies dwindle, while their cargo holds sat full of goods nobody could unload. Samsung alone reported $38 million of its own products trapped at sea and seriously considered chartering cargo planes just to fulfill customer orders. The ripple effects hit the entire industry, with freight rates on some routes spiking by as much as 50% almost overnight as shippers scrambled to book space on any carrier that wasn't Hanjin. Some analysts compared the moment to Lehman Brothers' collapse in 2008, not because the ships themselves were unsafe or poorly built. Every vessel in the fleet was fully seaworthy and fully loaded, but because an entire company's ability to operate had evaporated within days once creditors stopped believing it could pay its bills. The ships worked perfectly. The business behind them didn't survive the industry's own boom and bust cycle. Let's run the numbers on two scenarios. Optimistic case, you buy a $90 million mid-sized container ship, secure long-term charter contracts with 2 or 3 major shippers before it even enters service, guaranteeing steady utilization regardless of spot market swings. At a healthy long-term rate, the ship generates $25 million a year in charter revenue against fuel, crew, insurance, and maintenance costs of roughly $15 million, leaving a genuine $10 million annual margin, a solid return on an asset with a working life of 25 years or more. Realistic case, the same $90 million ship, purchased or newly built during an industry boom when freight rates are high and shipyards are full of new orders. Exactly the environment that preceded both the 2009 shipping downturn and Hanjin's eventual collapse. By the time the ship enters service, a wave of similarly timed new builds has flooded the market with capacity, and spot rates have fallen sharply. Without long-term contracts locked in ahead of time, the ship earns revenue closer to $12 million a year, barely covering operating costs once financing on the original purchase is factored in. Precisely the margin compression that turned an entire industry's fixed costs into unbearable weight during Hanjin's final years. So if you decide to own a container ship, understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying a fixed monopoly toll booth the way an airport or a seaport works, because unlike physical infrastructure, any competitor with enough capital can order an identical ship from the same shipyards you used, and the entire industry has a well-documented habit of ordering too many ships at exactly the same moment. Secure your cargo commitments before you take delivery, and a container ship can be a durable, cash-generating asset for decades. Buy into the boom without locking in demand first, and you may end up owning a perfectly functional, fully loaded vessel that the world's ports won't even let dock.